on the air with another episode of It's Not That Simple from the Francisco Manuel dos Santos Foundation. Today, we're going to talk about ageism. If I was going to ask you one thing that we all become in our lives, it would be old, right? So what does that mean? What does becoming old mean? How are old people perceived around the world? And is there discrimination? Well, we're going to address all of these questions and more with today's star guest. She is Ashton Applewhite, renowned writer and activist. Ashton is the author of The Chair Rocks, a manifest against ageism. She's also a leading spokesperson and emerging activist for the promotion of everything we can do to battle against ageism. She's spoken at the United Nations. She's been on the TED Talks main stage as well. Today, she is here with us on this show to break down this topic. So welcome, Ashton. First of all, to break it down for us, what is ageism and where do we find it?
Well, I'll answer the second question first. We find it everywhere, starting between our ears. And we have to recognize it between our ears before we can challenge it in the world at large, because most bias is unconscious. The dictionary definition is discrimination and stereotyping on the basis of age, just as racism is discrimination on the basis of race, etc. We are being ageist anytime we make an assumption about a person or a group of people on the basis of how old we think they are. Too young, as well as too old, right? It's any judgment on the basis of age.
What are the biggest myths as far as ageism is concerned, in your opinion?
There are so many, and you'll hear me talking mostly about discrimination against older people because we live in such a youth-centric society. I would say there's so many, they all drive me nuts, but the one that I probably dislike the most is the myth that all older people are alike. That at some point we fall off a cliff and join this lumpy gray mass of people called the elderly, with this "the" in front of it, or we just, become the same. And in fact, nothing could be further than the truth. All prejudice relies on stereotypes, the assumption that all members of a group are the same, which of course is never the case. It is especially inaccurate when it comes to age, because the longer we live, the more different from one another we become. The older the person, the less their age tells you about what they're doing, what they're capable of, their cognitive development, their physical capacity. It reveals less and less about us because we are so different.
The definition of becoming old is changing constantly as well, right? Because 2 or 3 generations ago, maybe when you hit your 40s or your 50s, you could be considered old because of the life expectancy. Now, obviously, and according to some statistics I saw, the number of people aged 65 or older is projected to more than double, from around 1.6 billion in 2050. So tell us about how the definition keeps changing and how the expectations keep shifting too.
Yeah, everyone, everywhere is living longer. The smile on my face is sort of rueful because it's very, very rare to have someone, even in their 70s, I am 72, or 80s or 90s, admit to being old, because the word has such pejorative associations. People say, I'm not old. Well, if there is more road behind you than ahead, you are definitely not young. And I tend to use the word older, right? We are certainly older. There is no point at which age begins, again, because the characteristics of age and aging are so diverse. They're different for each of us. So in the workforce, at least in most of the developed world, you are old at 30 in China in certain fields. You are old at 35 in advertising or tech, right? From the point of view of an employer. From the point of view of entering a home where, for older people, typically they allow people to enter at 50, 55, even most Social Security and benefits like that, Medicare in the United States starts at 65. So the point is twofold. There is no point at which we become old, and the hallmarks are different for even if I were to have, some sort of physical problem, the way it affects me could be very different from the way it affects someone else, depending on what I do for a living, on how much money I have, which always enters in, on what's important to me. I had a shoulder replacement. Well, I never played tennis. I'm not athletic, so it wasn't a big problem for me. But for someone who is invested in that, it would have been a big loss, and vice versa. So it's different for each of us. There is no point at which old begins.
You mentioned that we live in a youth-centered society, and in my opinion, it's become more accentuated because we live also in the age of social media that is increasingly a younger communications media, whatever way you look at it. Do you think that social media has also had a role to play in increasing the stereotypes and the distances between what it means to be young versus old?
I think it's both. I don't mean to waffle out of the answer, but there are also a lot of older people on social media. I use it a lot because my job is to be a communicator. It is certainly true that there are many more younger users on TikTok and Instagram than older, but there are a bunch of accounts of older people. There are younger women who follow older women who say, I want to be like her when I get older. So I think what social media does that is so pernicious, especially for young people, because we are more malleable and vulnerable when we're younger, is all this comparing of, especially of appearance. And any focus on women's appearance is toxic, period. I'm not going to say another word about it, but all of that is not good for us. We know it's bad for our self-esteem. We know there's a lot of shaming going around about body types and wrinkles and all that stuff. But there's also a lot of counter voices out there saying, this is stupid. And, here are some wonderful examples. So I think it depends on the context. And I think it can also be a tool for good. After all, those tools are free and they're democratic, and any older person who wants to get a message out there can do it.
I did want to talk to you about how much tougher it is for women, because at least in my community, I feel that there is increasingly more pressure for women to look younger, and they're resorting to more and more tools in order to make that happen, not just from a makeup standpoint, but from an artificial standpoint, whether that's surgery or other smaller procedures that they can do. Tell us how much tougher it is out there for women. I'm sure it's always been that way, but in today's society where image is so important, how much more do women suffer in this process?
I can't speak to that historically. I mean, aging is gendered. It is harder for women because we are judged more harshly for appearing, God forbid, to age. And so there are more pressures on women to alter our appearance. And I would say very clearly, no judgment on any of this. I have had, women say, look, if I didn't dye my hair to cover the gray, my boss would fire me. He would see how old I am. I would lose my job, and I have children to support.
Are you serious? Did women really?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, I used to be a little more judgy about that stuff. I mean, believe it or not, I don't dye my hair. No one believes me. I wouldn't believe me either. Anyway, I was a little more preachy about it. And she said, you don't get it. And I learned my lesson. There are so many pressures on women that I no longer say one syllable sincerely about how you look and what you do to look the way you feel you need to, because there are tremendous pressures on us. However, when we dye our hair just to cover the gray, or leave early accomplishments off our resume, or lie about our age to be younger, these behaviors aren't good for us because they are rooted in shame about something that shouldn't be shameful. And they give a pass to the underlying forces, the discrimination and stigma that makes those behaviors useful. So that's what I do, which is to push for underlying awareness and culture change around where those forces are. And an awful lot of them come from companies that profit, of course, from your insecurities and from your unhappiness, and want to sell you cosmetic, surgical procedures, diets, all those things to change the way you look to fit an impossible standard.
No doubt about that. There is a difference between being judged, we're all victims of that on a daily basis, multiple times, and being discriminated against, right? So give us examples of how...
Together.
Yeah, true. One leads to the other, right? I mean, you have to be judged before you can be discriminated against, I guess. But give us examples of what you notice when it comes to discrimination as far as age, both from a social, a professional, and a financial standpoint, perhaps.
Right. I have to write that down. Social, professional, and what was the third one?
Financial as
Financial.
well.
See, and I will tell you, I am ageist. I have always had a terrible memory, and when I see with a younger person and they can't remember the name of the movie they saw last week, so-and-so, I'm like, see, young people can't remember anything either.
How many phone numbers did we have to learn when we were younger?
Really?
And now nobody needs to know any phone numbers anymore.
I mean,
yeah.
Where we hear the most about age discrimination, I would say, is discrimination in the workplace, which interestingly, and of course, if you can't make a living, like that woman said, I have children to support. You will do whatever it takes to get a job or make enough money, to pay your rent. So I understand why that's paramount. Ageism in the workplace is often the first form of discrimination white men encounter, which is interesting, right? It's sort of, well, welcome to what the world is like for the rest of us. And you hear, I hear these tragic stories, or just look through LinkedIn, see the comments on my feeds of people who say, I have been doing this thing, I have been honing my skills, and now that I am a certain age, I can't get an interview. If I get an interview, it is over the minute I walk in the room or turn on my camera. And it is nuts to live in a world where experience has become a liability, especially in the face of a global labor shortage. It does depend a little bit on what field you're in. As I mentioned, tech and advertising are notoriously ageist. Other fields are somewhat better. Academia is more forgiving. But still, there is this pervasive prejudice, and it does... The World Health Organization defines ageism in terms of how we think, feel, and act about age and aging. So the discrimination is the acting piece. In the U.S., there is the Discrimination Against in Employment Act that becomes active at age 40, but that doesn't mean that it's easy to file a case. The standard of proof is higher, and the bureau that enforces it is understaffed and undervalued. So, it's not easy to make your case. And of course, the financial costs are tremendous also, especially for women who earn less and are penalized for time out of the workforce, typically on unpaid childcare. We earn less, right? And we live longer. So all these disadvantages are compounded by gender and by class as ever. So everywhere in the world, the people with the hardest time, or the sickest and the poorest, are old women of color.
You mentioned the World Health Organization. Tell us about their initiatives and their programs in order to try to battle this.
I'm so glad you asked that, because I love because the World Health Organization in 2021, it would have been 2020, but they were a little busy with a global pandemic, launched their global campaign to combat ageism. And that's its real name, not the name in my fantasies. And I want to point out that it is the World Health Organization, not the World Old People Organization, in acknowledgement of the fact that everyone is living longer, and with the goal of extending health span, our number of healthy years, along with longevity itself. And they realized that the biggest obstacle to that was age bias, starting between our ears, how we think and feel about getting older. Because if you think you're just, these aches and pains or whatever is just what happens when you get older, you're not going to take care of it, and you're not going to engage in healthy behaviors starting young, right? There are very few diseases of old age. Most of them are conditions that start when we were younger and then become symptomatic as we get older. That's part of it. The other piece of it that is so interesting is the growing body of evidence that shows that attitudes towards aging affect how our minds and bodies function at the cellular level. Wow. People with positive and accurate feelings about aging live longer, a lot longer, 7.5 years longer. We walk quicker. We are less likely to develop Alzheimer's, even if we have the gene that predisposes us to the disease. These more accurate beliefs protect us from stress and the effects of living in a culture that discriminates against us. There's an awful lot about aging we can't affect, right? An awful lot of luck and a lot, and huge global forces, but we can control our attitudes. Relearning is not easy, but it is doable and it is free.
The expectations for me is something that's crazy with when it comes to stereotypes about age, because there's so many times that we all become surprised about people of a certain age who I guess overcome a lot of the expectations that we have and can perform certain tasks, whether they be physical or intellectual, that we're not expecting from them. So what can we do to educate ourselves on what older people can do, Ashton, so we don't have those expectations that sometimes are very low?
Yeah, well, I have a whole passage in my book about becoming an old person in training, which was a phrase I picked up from a geriatrician named Joanne Lynn when I started down this path about 20 years ago. And I was like, I'm not old, and I don't know if any of that awful stuff is ever going to happen to me, but I could start to look at and learn from the older people around me. I could acknowledge that I might actually get old and join their numbers. So it's just a little trick of the mind, right? Because ageism sinks its claws into us in denial. Like, I'm not old, I don't want to belong to that club, that will never happen to me. And so the most important thing we can do is to acknowledge that we will get old. And when we do, it's sort of paradoxical, but only in an ageist culture. The more you actually know about age and aging, the less fear it holds for you. So there is that step. And again, most bias is unconscious, and we can't confront something that we don't know is there. So paradoxically, look for ways in which you are ageist instead of for evidence that you are not. The best thing we can do is to have friends and contact with people of all ages, just like it is pretty hard to remain homophobic if you are friends with people of all sexual orientations. We see the communities where people live longest and best are mixed age. They are age diverse, where we see that people of all ages have a role and have lives with meaning. You don't have to run a company. You don't have to end ageism. You definitely do not have to jump out of airplanes. But if you look at around you at the older people who are in the world in all sorts of interesting ways, and we are out there, right? And I have a feeling that Portugal is less age segregated than in the United States. I always think everything is better outside the US, but we have a very age segregated society here. Make an older or younger friend. That in itself is an anti-ageist act. Think of something you like to do and find a mixed age group to do it with.
I do think culturally, maybe some Latin European countries have more of a link between generations because of how strong the family unit is, and how often they are together and spend time together. And that leads me to a question where, do you have a model of where in today's society we can look up to for a dynamic that works and is an example?
There's no perfect place.
No.
In India, the vast majority of older people live with their families, into old age and death. There is no stigma or shame around receiving help of all kinds, just as you did when you were a baby, including with toileting. Imagine that. It's just part of life, which is evidence, that these values are cultural. We're not stuck ones we grew up with. Societies that put older people on a pedestal, people often say, like, isn't it better somewhere else? And they look wistfully eastward, having this sort of idea that in magic China or magic Eastern place that older people are venerated and valued. And it is true that where there was a tradition, and in some places still is, of Confucianism, of filial piety, where children are raised to be very obedient and respectful of all older people, there is more respect for older people. But those societies are not great to be young in, right? I mean, most countries, when the median income rises, younger people move out of the family home. There are huge losses. We lose this connection. We lose this intergenerational contact unless we can find it outside the family and, of course, include our families in it. So there's always a trade-off. I don't want to be on a pedestal. I don't think older people are more valuable or even more wise than young people. I want a world where everyone is treated with respect and where age is neutral, where I'm not embarrassed to be old, I'm not ashamed of my age, but I also don't think it gives me extra different treatment, except insofar as we get older, our bodies do work less well. Not necessarily our minds, but I might want that chair. I might want a place closer to the fire. And in that sense, as a compensation for perhaps for some of us, reduced physical function, and a lot of older people will be angry when they hear me say that, because they're like, no, I can wear more clothes. I can stand as long as a young person. Maybe you can, but a lot of older people cannot. So in that sense, I think being older deserves perhaps an extra affordance, but that's it. Age should be neutral.
You've obviously spent a great part of your career raising awareness to this phenomenon. From a practical standpoint, in your opinion, what can be done as a society from an educational standpoint, concretely on a day-to-day basis to kind of make it go away as much as possible from every sense? So in order to dismantle it on the ground, what kind of practical advice would you have?
Well, I'm smiling because, of course, it's a huge question, and I think that it is doable. We will never get rid of ageism. We know that every form of bias, racism, sexism, homophobia, they all intersect and inform each other, right? Aging is gendered, so we need to also address sexism. There's tremendous stigma around the loss of physical or cognitive capacity. The word for that in English is ableism, around ability. We need to undo that as well. We're never going to get rid of all these things, but the good news is that when we think about any aspect of this and chip away at the fear and ignorance that underlie every prejudice and bias, we chip away at them all. The very first thing we can do is to think about how we ourselves think about age and aging. How do you use the words old and young? Start there. When people say, I don't feel old, what they really mean is I don't feel ugly, I don't feel useless, I don't feel incompetent. I felt all those things at 13, way worse than I have ever felt them since. So start to just look for evidence that you are biased, because we are all biased. I am ageist. I think and do ageist things all the time, but look for it. And then once you have that awareness, which is not fun, but once you see it in yourself, you start to see it in the world around you automatically. That happens. It's like letting a genie out of a bottle. And that is really liberating, because then you start to see it in the world around you. And you're like, oh, it's not just me. It's not that I am bad or that I'm, a failure. It's embedded in our social and economic systems. And that means that we can come together and do something about it. And I want to mention a website called Old School, which is a pun, oldschool.info, which is a resource bank of hundreds of free and carefully vetted resources. Everything is free except the books. So go there, oldschool.info, search it under language, search it under gender, just noodle around, look at an infographic. If you have a workforce question, if you have a language question, because I'm really, a global movement to end ageism is underway. And my evidence, I launched the site with two other people in 2018, and it did not contain a campaigns section. And now there are over 30 campaigns around the world, including the World Health Organization. England just launched a national campaign this February. So you can find people doing this work, and you can find out how to join it in lots of ways. And you can also meet up. We do weekly Zooms. Anyone can join. So if you have questions or want some support, come find me online.
You know what's interesting in the English language as well, as far as the stigma, is when you say how old you are. You are whatever years old, and that doesn't happen in many other languages. And I I think maybe when people have a pun and say, well, I'm actually 60 years young, but that old qualification already brings the kind of stigma into it, don't you think, as well, a little bit?
Only because old is stigmatized.
Yeah.
We need to towards a culture where old is neutral. I mean, to say I'm 72 years young is to commit sort of the original sin, if you will, because it is to say
because you're
young is
battling,
good
yeah.
and old is bad. So,
Yeah.
that's not, I mean, I do know I have someone, I know there are languages that say, how long have you lived? One little trick is if you say, I was born in 1952, you are foregrounding the fact that you've been around for a while. You've seen some stuff. You've done some things, which is how it should be. It is not a neutral fact in that sense. And then, of course, if the person is like me, they can't do the math. So they're going like, how old would that be?
Yeah.
So it focuses, age is real. We should name our age. It shouldn't be hidden away, but it should be neutral.
We've obviously focused a great part of this discussion on age and ageism towards the old spectrum, or towards the experienced, mature spectrum.
Old is okay. It's old. We're old.
Exactly. But when it comes to ageism towards the young, what's your perspective on that?
It's funny. It's one of the tangles I get into with people sometimes who call it reverse ageism or adultism. Most people call it ageism. It's all ageism. It is any judgment on the basis of age. And I think it's important to use one word because we are all up against the same thing, which is someone making an assumption about us, what we're capable of or interested in because of how old they think we are. Young people experience a lot of it. I mean, I don't know. I remember as especially as a teenager, being filled with, sort of indignation that people didn't trust me to do something. And it's true that I had less experience, but you never know. You need to talk to that person, whether they are 16 or 60. What do you know? What are you good at? What can you do in this position? And find out always as an individual, independent of what they look like or how old they are, etc. Young people typically have trouble getting started in the job market. Again, gender plays heavily into this. Women are never the right age. Right? Wow. We are sexualized at an early age. When we enter the job market, that is held against us. We're too sexy or cute to be taken seriously. Then we are too fertile. If a woman gets pregnant, her pay goes down or she is vulnerable to being laid off the job. Yes. If a man says, I'm going to become a father, he gets a raise. Right? So you are too fertile and become a liability to employers. And then boom, you're not sexy or fertile anymore. And it's over. So there is never a right age. This makes me very angry. And it is truly, ageism is the one bias that starts when we are very young and pursues every human being straight through to the end.
I can tell you're very passionate about this. No doubt about it. Ashton, we're gonna wrap up our conversation with a series of quick fire questions that we ask all our guests. So in one word or sentence, if you could please try to answer the following questions. The first one is, what is a personality trait that a good leader could really benefit from having, and why?
Oh, I think generosity. It's always more helpful if you call people in, instead of criticizing, to figure out a way. It's not easy to do, but a way where something they are doing is on a path that is useful or constructive, and to draw on that strength and to have as broad a vision as possible of the ways in which people could support the thing that you hope to advance.
What is the biggest challenge humanity is facing today?
Climate change. And that is a huge reason why we need to make friends and allies of all ages, because we need all the people from all the places of all the ages, pressing for in order to address it.
If you could change one thing today by magic, what would that be?
Whoa. Wow, that's a really tough one. you know, I would block but it's a complicated question because it's biology and economics and all the things. I would perform a simultaneous operation on every brain and set of ethics in everyone to eliminate our habit of ranking humans in hierarchies of value.
That could be a topic for a conversation in itself. I completely,
well,
I get
that's
that.
What you deserve for asking such a big question.
It is. And finally, what is the biggest learning of your life and career?
Oh, geez. This sounds cheesy, but you know, I don't think I know it yet. I mean, I am a generalist. I've never been able to specialize in anything. If you had told me 20 years ago I would be fascinated by aging, I would have said, ooh, why do I want to think about something sad that old people do? And we are aging from the minute we are born. It touches on every aspect of being human, every domain of study. So you know, every week or whatever, I encounter some new idea or some better way to say something or a new lens to think about how we move through life. So I think it's in my future.
Okay, that was a really long sentence, but that's fine. It was the last. It was the last answer. Ashton Applewhite, what a delight it was to have an opportunity to discuss this such impactful topic with you. Thank you so much for sharing your insight and expertise with us.
You're very welcome. Thank you for having me.
It's not that simple. That's the title of the show, and definitely this topic is not that simple to break down either. I think Ashton did her best, and she succeeded in making us understand this phenomenon a lot better than we did at the start of this show. It was obviously a pleasure to have you on that side following this conversation. See you again very soon on another episode of the series from the Francisco Manuel dos Santos Foundation. Take care.